This episode of Zero Hour is brought to you by Steel Hat Productions, and whilst it describes events leading up to and including a violent episode in the history of the Australian bikie scene and the TV series which covers it, at no point am I trying to either demonise or glorify the associated lifestyle. Joining a motorcycle club is not for everyone, and despite media outlets telling us otherwise, it's not always as despicable as you were led to believe. However, I won't be forcing my opinions on you and encourage you to make up your own mind. Bikie Wars Brothers in Arms is an Australian miniseries that on release was one that I'd looked forward to watching, even if it was with some apprehension that it would be an inaccurate portrayal not only of the events it was depicting, but also the bikie scene in Australia. Sons of Anarchy, an American series, was extremely popular at the time, even though it was blatantly fictional and a fantasy story that was 50% born, 50% shit. My apprehensions were not unfounded, as Sons of Anarchy had set the bar at a certain level where the truth was considered to be less important than a marketable story. So, what's it all about? Based on the book of the same name by Lindsay, Simpson and Sandra Harvey, about the war that exploded between the Comanchero and Bandidos motorcycle clubs in Sydney during the early to mid-1980s, culminating in a huge brawl and shootout at the Viking Tavern in Milperra. It was first shown in 2012 on the Tavern Network in Australia and was made for a budget of 6 million Australian dollars. Its run was for 6 episodes and was later released onto a 2 DVD set, which I do have. The first episode won its time slot with 1.26 million viewers based on the overnight numbers, peaking at 1.43 million viewers. However, numbers dropped during the next 3 episodes, eventually retopping the million mark for the last 2, but only the final episode made it back inside the top 10 in overnight ratings. What really happened? In my opinion, the Milperra shootout was one of the biggest news stories of my early childhood years, and is definitely the first one that I can remember seeing on TV. Probably as big a story as the Chamberlains and the wedding of Charles and Diana at the time for me. So having said that, there's not a great deal of source material out there really, aside from some mentions in a few biographies. And it took a hell of a long time for a TV series to be made, especially when you consider how much the Aussie entertainment industry loved the historical miniseries in the late 80s and early 90s. The so-named Milperra massacre occurred on September 2nd, 1984, in the Sydney suburb of Milperra in Australia. It was a violent confrontation between 2 outlaw motorcycle clubs, the Bandidos and the Comancheros, that resulted in the deaths of 7 people. The confrontation began when a group of heavily armed Comancheros arrived at a swap meet attended by the Bandidos in Milperra. A fight then broke out and it escalated into a gun battle involving more than 50 people. Police eventually intervened and stopped the violence, which had started to cease by that stage anyway, due to the aforementioned 7 people being killed. A further 28 others were injured. What became known as the Milperra Massacre was one of the deadliest episodes in Australia's outlaw motorcycle club history and led to increased scrutiny of these groups by law enforcement agencies. It also resulted in a number of criminal convictions, including several for murder and manslaughter. Of the main people involved, Comanchero's leader, Jock Ross, was convicted for life but only served 5 years. Snotty Spencer of the Bandidos hung himself in prison before he was able to stand trial. And as all of the Bandidos arrested were charged in regards to all of the deaths, this strangely resulted in Caesar Campbell being found guilty of the manslaughter of his own brother, which was a ridiculous carriage of justice. It showed that the court would just out to nab anyone for anything, rather than specifically for their own exact actions. A further 4 Comancheros received life sentences, although 3 later had their murder charges downgraded to manslaughter on appeal. 16 Bandidos members received 7-year sentences for manslaughter. So who made it? It was written by Greg Hadrick of Home and Away, Sons and Daughters, Underbelly and Pine Gap fame, Roger Simpson of the Halifax series, who was also the producer, and Joe Martino of Satisfaction and Sea Change. Peter Andrikidis, Chopper the Untold Story, and Heroes Mountain was the director. The cast is an absolute who's who of the Aussie TV and movie industry at the time, with a huge depth of talent, including Matt Nable as Jock Ross, who was in Mr. In Between, Underbelly Badness, 1%, and the Gallipoli series. Callan Mulvey as Snotty Spencer, the original Underbelly, Last King of the Cross, Rush, and Heartbreak High. Anthony Hayes as Caesar Campbell, who's also been in Animal Kingdom, Danger Close, The Battle of Long Tan, and the Gallipoli series. Susie Porter as Vanessa Ross. She's in Two Hands, Star Wars Attack of the Clones, and a few other reasonably well-known Aussie series. Jeremy Lindsay Taylor as Leroy, who was in Underbelly Razor, played a great job in that one. Romper Stomper, the TV series, not the movie. The Gallipoli series, Sea Patrol, and the Claremont Murders. And I reckon he's just one of the best actors we've got in this country in more recent times. Really does play a role really well. Also, and it was Luke Ford as Snow. He was in Red Dog and Kokoda. I think he was great in Kokoda. I haven't actually seen Red Dog, surprisingly. Damien Walsh Howling from Blue Healers and the original Underbelly, where he played Benji Benjamin, did a great job. And some of the others, such as Luke Hemsworth, Richard Cawthorne, Fletcher Humphreys, Todd Lassance, and Dougie the Pizza Boy, whose name I think is Dermot Herdenrick. What they got right. Well, the bikes were Harley shovel heads, which were made between 1966 and 1984. So that's pretty spot on, really, for the period. The smaller Sportster-looking bikes were period iron heads. And sort of looking at it, it could be argued that due to cost and availability back then, Harleys were not entirely necessary to be used by clubs. A lot of them favoured British bikes in Australia in the 70s and early 80s. But if you're making a TV series, that's not going to sell the message of big, tough bikies to the audiences, I wouldn't have thought. Speaking to my dad and some other old timers about the time, it does seem that carrying guns in and on vehicles was quite common, not going to attract much attention in those days. And from what I've heard from some other people who were sort of in the scene at the time, even people who were just farmers and so forth, you can walk around with a gun slung over your shoulder, and especially in the country, but in some parts of the cities as well. And no one even batted an eyelid. But having said that, the shootout did change all of those laws regarding gun ownership and the way you could secure your guns and the carry and all those sort of things. So I think the portrayal of Leanne Walters in the series, she's the 14-year-old girl who was killed as a result of being an innocent bystander at the swap meet. It does show a balance based on various different accounts. There's a few different stories as to whether she was close to the bikies or just happened to be unluckily there selling raffle tickets and didn't really know anyone. But it comes down to who you want to believe, really. I feel her character was written in a respectful way, while also leaving it open to interpretation as far as her relationship with the bikie scene goes. The soundtrack is an absolute banger and enhances the shit out of this series, which definitely needed a kick along at times. The main theme and some of the other songs are done by Mark Lizotte of Tony Diesel and the Injectors fame. Pretty good band from back in the 80s. And yeah, he had a lot of good solo stuff as well. I think there's a bit of Rose Tattoo and some of the other sort of more applicable Aussie heavy rock of the time as well that just really does fit in really, really well. Yeah, I've never met Jock Ross, but I've seen some TV interviews with him post Milperra, and Nable definitely looks similar to him and nails the accent pretty well also, in my opinion. What they got wrong. the patches were not totally period correct. And I pissed myself laughing. I saw the character Snow. He had a Sons of Anarchy patch on the front of his vest, which is pretty hilarious, really. Um, I mean, really, even people in the makeup and clothing department of the production company should have known what they were getting their hands on and putting on the jackets, I would have thought. But I guess at the end of the day, you'd have to know to really know, if you know what I mean. And yeah, Caesar also had both a sergeant at arms and an enforcer patch on his jacket, which, in my understanding, and I'm not 100% on this, but as far as I know, it's inaccurate, is you can only have one or the other. Happy to be proven wrong on that, though. And yeah, obviously, there's a few necessary departures from the club colours due to copyright and other reasons, so they don't look exactly as they do in real life, but I guess they kind of get it close enough. So in the series, you see all the bikies riding around with no helmets on, which is interesting because helmet laws were well and truly in place at the time and had been around, I believe, since the late 60s in Australia. And while clubs were living on the other side of the law for the majority of their lives, members still wore helmets to avoid unnecessary attention from the cops. So that's probably something that they could have done a bit better. But again, it goes down to the image they're trying to sell to the viewership, I guess. The levers were probably a little bit too clean and neat for that period look they were trying to go for. Um, Back then, a lot of bikies were always working on their bikes, especially if they had Harleys, because they used to break down a lot back then. And they weren't always showering or washing their clothes as a result. And also, as a big fuck you to the square society, a lot of the early bikers as well were hippies from previous times, and we all know how much they loved washing. You see the guys when they pull up at the pub early on in the first episode, parking their bikes facing inwards to a building. That would never have happened. That's not the way motorcycle clubs do things. Even in these days, they park with their nose facing out. So if there is any sort of trouble, they can make a pretty quick getaway, just jump on their bikes and ride away without having to back up and get in each other's way and that sort of thing. When the clubhouse is shot up, all the men dive for cover, leaving the naked lady on their pool table. I reckon Realisy bikies probably would have protected her at any cost and try to make sure she was safe before anything else, especially back then. Caesar Campbell is portrayed as being short and fat in the series, whereas in real life he was actually really tall and built like an absolute brick shithouse. A few people I know have met him in person and they've said that whilst they kind of got the spirit of what he was about right, they just, yeah, didn't really nail the look or the way he acted, body language, that sort of thing. I think they probably put most of their research into Jock Ross and just left the other guys as a bit of an afterthought, which they should have definitely have done better than what they did. And you see as well in the early episodes, they're driving around in their cars wearing their club colours, which is a massive no-no in clubland. Well, it was back then anyway. And I know when I sort of knew some people in the scene in the 90s and early 2000s, they still weren't doing it then. It's pretty shocking, really, to see that as far as I'm concerned, it's poorly researched. And as well, the portrayal of the women being involved in club politics and decision making. That's not me being sexist either. It's actually how it was back then and possibly still is. You see a lot of that in Sons of Anarchy as well, where they try to show that the women control the clubs, which, from my understanding, doesn't happen in real life. So my favourite moments, and without showing any sort of bias, I guess, all the best scenes, in my opinion, feature Caesar Campbell. The one where he grabs a billiard ball inside his fist and whacks a bloke. Then the one later, when his mere presence scares the shit out of a couple of the Comancheros, characterize everything I've ever heard about the man in real life. A couple of funny ones as well, where Jock Ross was complaining about the Campbells doing something to his family back in the 1600s. Apparently, he really said that, as did the time he postponed going to fight them because he wanted to watch a TV show. I think it was Dallas or Dynasty. I can't remember. That's not really that important anyway. And yeah, I did feel watching the series at the time that both were portrayed really well and provided some light-hearted comedy. So yeah, in summary, look, it had the potential to surpass Stone and Mad Max as the most recognisable and iconic Aussie biker movies, but did let itself down in the end and sits below them pretty comfortably. Now, whilst it's an entertaining and somewhat accurate series in certain areas, Caesar Campbell's book Enforcer would have made a much more accurate base for the storyline, even if just as a base to the story with extra input from the other side to give it a bit of balance. Overall, it was reasonably well acted, a bit slow in parts, but did maintain the tension where necessary. For a made-for-TV series, it did have enough menace, despite being somewhat sanitised for mainstream audiences. Mulvey and Nabel definitely can act, and you can really see they bring out a lot of that talent in their characters. And whether you love or hate the characters or not, they carried the show and were the most believable guys on it, in my opinion, compared to most of the other bikies who look like middle-class kids with wigs and glued-on mustaches, which back then they had real beards and real mustaches and real long hair, and they were real men. Jeremy Lindsay Taylor is probably another who stood out on his acting chops, and at least he looked like he had a real beard. Probably went for one episode too long, and what was shown could have been condensed more to allow for more important info that was left out, such as what the clubs were doing to make money other than going to regular jobs, because not all of them did. And yeah, how else did they function other than just getting pissed and bashing people? I feel it could have also been explained what the real reason for the war was, fought over better, and they could have added a lot more interactions with the cops than there is throughout the 6 episodes. I mean, look, we all know that the cops and the bikies have never been on the same side. And obviously the bikies are trying to avoid the attention, but the coppers love giving it to them and love disrupting their lifestyle. Even now, that still happens. So there it is. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any future content. As far as I'm concerned, Brothers in Arms Bikie Wars probably gets maybe a 5 or a 6 out of 10. It was good, not great, could have been better, and probably should have been made maybe by someone other than the Network 10, who are a pretty shitty network that I think are just about to go out of business, 11 years after the series came out. So that probably says a lot. Anyway, I'll see you at the next one.